High School, and we can support in all phases, and between the three schools there's a real breadth of knowledge in how to support with your EdTech journey. Presenting today is Sarah Alderman, who is Highfurlong School's speech and language therapist. Just to remind everyone, if they can please mute your microphones and switch your cameras off. And any questions, if you can please put them in the chat box, and I will present them to Sarah at the end. And this is being recorded. Thank you, and over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Erica. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Alderman, as Erica just said, and I am a specialist speech and language therapist working within Highfurlong School. And our topic today is using symbol-based software. So we're going to have a look at a range of different software that you can make your own visuals with. And having worked in both mainstream and special education settings, I can really recommend that symbol-based software is something that will be really useful for your school setting, as you can tailor make visuals for your whole class or for individual students. So we'll be covering lots on that topic today. Before we get started, as Erica mentioned, we are part of the EdTech Demonstrator Consortium with 2 other schools. So we're offering lots of advice and support on using technology to support teaching and learning. And if you'd like to sign up for that and you'd like a little bit of EdTech support for your school, there is a link on the final slide today. And that's a free service, and we cover all areas of technology. So Highfurlong are specifically looking at things like assistive technology and communication aids. And if that's something that interests you, please feel free to sign up. So in our webinar today, these are the things that we're going to cover. We're going to look at what symbols are and how they can be used, how students can benefit from the use of symbols. So we'll look at how they can benefit your entire class or how they can benefit individual students. We'll look at how to make a range of different resources to support students' needs. And then at the end, we're going to have a look at the software that's available and the features of each. There's around 4 different types of software that is commonly used in UK schools, and each of them has slightly different features. So I think it might be useful for you if you're considering purchasing symbol-based software or trialing symbol-based software to try and match some of the features to the needs of your school. So let's get started. So we'll start with the basics. What are symbols? So symbols are basically a visual way of representing words, and we use them every day in life to reinforce messages. So you can see at the top here, I have some symbols that you would find on labels for clothing that tell us how we should wash our clothes. So that's just one example of symbols that we see every day, but we also see symbols on road signs, on maps, on places of interest and other signs. So it's a really helpful visual tool that quickly conveys a message and reinforces that message in a visual way. So if it helps us in our everyday life, it would make sense that it would also help the children who we teach with their learning and understanding. So symbols can help children to communicate or to understand the meaning of text or verbal instructions. You can see in the bottom corner, there's an example of lots of different ways that one word can be represented using different symbols. And there are lots of different types of symbol sets, but they all represent the same word. So in the bottom corner, we have the word want represented using different symbols. And as I mentioned before, there's a range of different symbol-based software, which allows you as a school to tailor make resources for whole classes or specific students. And we'll have a look at those types of software towards the end of today's webinar. I thought we'd start with why we use symbols. And basically, symbol-based software is a brilliant way to make visuals, both for communication and to support understanding. And I thought I'd use this little visual as it's something I've seen quite a lot on social media. You might have seen it on Twitter or Facebook. And it really is a nice way to summarize 9 reasons why we should use visuals in the classroom. And I'm going to quickly just run through these reasons. So the first is visuals are permanent, whereas spoken words disappear. So for example, if you were working with students who had auditory memory difficulties or difficulty processing language, they would really struggle to follow auditory instructions alone, but having a visual to back up your message will make it much easier for them to remember a set of instructions and complete a task independently. So similar to that, visuals allow time for language processing. So again, some children have delayed processing of auditory information, and obviously if you have a delay in your processing, that makes it very easy to forget something that you've heard. So again, a visual can really back up the auditory information that you've heard. Next to that, you'll see visuals prepare students for transitions. This is probably the most common reason that when you think of symbol-based software, you think of things like visual timetables and now next boards. And it's a really important use of visuals. I think thinking about going back to school in September, obviously our children have been having a different routine at home, and restarting in September might feel a little bit unsettling and it might cause quite a lot of anxiety. So having visuals like our first and then boards and visual timetables could be really useful to settle students back into that school routine. Down here we've got visuals help children to see what you mean. So for example, if you were introducing a new language concept, it can be quite difficult sometimes to visually represent a concept. Let's say you were looking at words like before and after. Having a symbol that somehow visually represents that concept can make it much easier for the child to link a meaning to those new words and then to store those new words accurately. As I mentioned before, visuals help to build independence, which can really help students to feel a sense of confidence. Visuals are transferable between environments and people. So if a student is moving around the school between classes, they can take important visuals with them. It's also really useful to have the same visuals that are used in school at home to ensure that consistency. This is an interesting one. Visuals have no attitude. They have no tone, no frustration, and no disapproval. I think sometimes when a student maybe asks for instructions to be repeated for the third or fourth time, it can sometimes be that a tone of frustration might creep into your voice, and a visual doesn't have that attitude. So obviously that's much more comforting for a student to refer to. Visuals help to reduce anxiety. So as I mentioned before, I think in September we'll have a few anxious students coming back. Everything is slightly different. Everything's a little bit new, and they've had a number of months where they've been a little bit out of routine. So having visuals to support with identifying emotions and regulating emotions are really important, and we'll have a look at some of those in a minute. In the middle, it says visuals help all students, and I think that's really important. So while we'll look at some visuals that might support specific students today, a lot of visuals can be used with entire classes and will have benefits for everybody. I thought this little infographic really demonstrates why visuals are useful for everybody. So at the bottom, it says people remember 80% of things that they see, so 80% of images, which is really quite high, whereas they remember 20% of text and 10% of things they've heard, so auditory instructions. So I think those statistics in themselves show that having an image to back up either what you're reading or what you're hearing can really help a student to remember the information that's been presented to them and help them to apply that information more easily. So who uses symbols? As I've just been saying for the last few slides, everybody can use symbols. You can use them with the whole class to visually reinforce routines, to introduce new concepts and support literacy skills. But as well as that, they can also really help specific groups of students. So I thought we'd talk about some of the students who will really benefit from visuals made specifically for them. So the first is students with autism or autistic spectrum condition. We know that many students with autism struggle with auditory processing, so they struggle to process information that they've heard. They also struggle to gauge the nuances of things like body language and vocal tone. So having visuals can really help with things like that. Visuals can support a child with autism with both their communication skills and their understanding and processing of information. The second one here, students with EAL, English as an Additional Language. So if you have a student in your class and their home language isn't English, you can imagine it must be very challenging for them to understand new concepts and the things that they're learning on a daily basis. Some symbol-based software has a really clever feature called dual language. We'll have a little bit of a look at that later, but the dual language feature allows you to make resources in both the student's home language and their English language. So those resources can really support them both to develop their home language and the new spoken language of English. I think it's also really nice to send those resources home so that parents can understand what the student is learning in school. Visuals also can support students with emotional or behavioural needs. So it's that idea of recognising how you're feeling and then being able to regulate those emotions. And visuals are a really powerful way of doing that. And we'll look at that in just a little minute. Visuals are great for students with speech, language or communication needs. There are lots of programs that us speech and language therapists use, like colourful semantics and shape coding. And for those kind of programs, we use this type of software again and again. And many of these programs are now being commonly used in school settings. So being able to access those type of visual resources and make your own is really, really important. And our final one, those who have unclear speech, limited speech, or selective mutism. So if a child has very limited verbal speech or their speech is very unclear, they generally need something to supplement their communication. So you can see in the top corner here, this is a picture of a communication book, which can be used to help a student to get their message across. If you're interested in this, we ran a webinar a few weeks ago on alternative forms of communication, and we looked at communication books in depth. So please check out the website and have a little look at that link if you're interested. But we will touch on communication books and boards a little more in this webinar too. So what resources can I make using symbol-based software? I thought I'd run you through some of the most common resources that I use and make and talk to schools about using, but this is not an exhaustive list by any means, because when you have symbol-based software, you can make so many different visuals, you can make almost anything you can think of. But I thought I would run you through some common visuals that we do use. If I mention something that you haven't heard of before, please feel free to email me if you want a little bit more information, or most of these terms that I might use, you can Google and I'm sure you'll find a wealth of information, but I'll run you through some of our ideas. I thought I would start with what we're probably all most familiar with in terms of using visual-based communication software, and these are visual timetables and now and next boards. So you can see on this slide we have a very broad range of visual timetables, and I thought this was a nice way to demonstrate how you can tailor-make a visual timetable. So I know you can go on Twinkle or other websites and you can print ready-made timetables, but being able to make your own really allows you to think about specific children's needs or the needs of your class and to tie in with that. So at the bottom we have a now and next board. This is really useful for a student who might be overwhelmed by having the whole day presented as a visual. So you can see the pink strips on the side. They have the whole day represented at a glance. So some students might need the day chunked into what's happening now and what's happening next. Now and next boards are also really useful for students who find certain tasks difficult and challenging. So for example, if I was working with a student and I knew that they really didn't like maths, I might put maths on my now, and then I would ask them what they want to do next. So they might choose 5 minutes on the iPad, and that would go on the next square. And then throughout the activity that the student finds challenging, our maths activity, we can refer to the now and next board and say, yes, now it's maths, but next it's iPad. So it's providing a nice visual that shows that at the end of this activity that's quite difficult, something nice and rewarding is going to happen, which is a really great way to keep students on task. So as I mentioned before, this is the whole day represented at a glance on Velcro strips. What's nice about this is you can get your class involved and they can pull off a symbol as they finish that activity. And that's a really nice way to transition as well. So once you've finished the register, taking it off, posting it or putting it in an envelope so the students know that that activity is finished and we're on to the next one. Our more complicated visual timetable on the side here is the whole week represented at a glance in a visual. This is really nice for older students, perhaps for high school students or older primary age students. I think it's quite useful for students who feel anxious about topics that are coming up during the week, as they can refer to it at home and be aware of what's happening the next day. It's also really useful for students who struggle with maybe organisational skills. So you can see here on a Thursday, this student has double cookery. So on a Wednesday night, they might refer to their timetable and think, okay, I need to bring this equipment with me. So it can really help with that organisational skills as well. So I mentioned this earlier, how visuals can really support with regulation of emotions and for making behaviour supports. So someone has used Boardmaker to make these lovely visuals. On our right side of the screen, you can see zones of regulation. This is a really popular program which helps students to identify how they feel and then to think about strategies or tools that they could use to deal with those emotions. So you can see here we have the blue area, which is the rest area where a student might feel bored or sad. And then at the bottom, we have tools that they could use to help them in how they're feeling. The green area is go, so the student is ready to work. Our yellow area is slow, so the student is maybe experiencing a few difficulties, they're feeling a bit frustrated or worried. And again, we have strategies related to that. Here we have the red area, stop, when the student is maybe feeling angry or overwhelmed and needs to take a break. So the idea is that you would teach the children in your class, or perhaps a specific student who's using this program, to recognise how they feel and then to identify tools that would help them in dealing with those emotions, so regulating their emotions. And again, I think coming up to September, when there might be a lot of anxiety around returning to school and returning to routines, having something like zones of regulation is a great way to check in with students throughout the day, to check how they're feeling and check how you can tweak things to make things a little bit easier for them. This is a similar idea on the left-hand side of the screen. It's an emotion thermometer. So again, you can get the students quite involved in these type of activities. They can talk about what each emotion looks, sounds and feels like. And then they can think about their own strategies, so ideas that might help them when they feel that way, or ways that an adult might be able to support them if they're feeling a certain emotion. So being able to make your own behavior visuals and emotion visuals is really useful, especially if you're tailor making it to a specific student. Something else that symbol-based software is really useful for is just general language within the classroom, so supporting vocabulary development. You might have schemes like word of the day, where you might have a symbol that represents the word. You can see here, this was made in Widgit software, and it's a pack of work surrounding St. George's Day. So there are lots of flashcards representing the vocabulary, and these type of activities are ready-made and accessible. Having a visual to go alongside new concepts and new words really helps students to remember those words and to use them in their own work. At the side here, we have something that's known as colourful semantics, which is used quite frequently in schools across the UK, and it's used very frequently by speech and language therapists. It's a really useful tool for working on sentence structuring and narrative, and the idea is that each part of a sentence is represented by a colour, and then you can use symbols to tie in with the topics that you're doing in the classroom. So you can see here someone has retold the story of the tiger who came to tea using colourful semantics and symbols. And you could tie this in with any book that you are covering in the classroom. If you have symbol-based software, as you can simply make those resources and print them and laminate them and keep them for use again and again. I mentioned this previously, but many students do struggle with auditory information. And as the statistics showed at the start, we remember 20% of text, roughly 10% of what we hear. So having a visual to back up instructions is really important. So you can see this one, sorry it's a little bit blurred, is a recipe. This is also really good for students who maybe have difficulties with their literacy skills or difficulties inferring meaning from text. So by looking at this, they have a little bit of a visual prompt as to what the text means, and they could follow the instructions around making a sandwich quite easily by looking at the visual symbols. It's also really nice to present sequences of actions and activities in a visual format. This one would obviously be quite useful for the moment, washing my hands. Again, you can make these resources or print off ready-made ones, laminate them, and you could stick that up on your sink area so that students can refer to it as and when they need to. I'll briefly touch on social stories, which may or may not be something that you're already familiar with. Symbols are a great way to bring social stories to life. So social stories are basically a way of explaining a social situation and suggesting reactions and responses to that situation. They're frequently used with children who have autism, but they're also really useful for children with social communication difficulties or children with speech and language difficulties. So you can see the first story here is actually about returning to school at the moment. So I found this one on Twitter on an account called Reach Out ASC, and it was designed for a child with autism. And it says, "It is Thursday. I'm going to school for a few hours. The world is still shut, but some parts are opening up. We can go to school for 1.5 days. School looks different, but it is okay." So you can see how the visual helps the student to understand the story, and also it will help them to remember the story. I think social stories are incredibly useful at the moment as we can explain new concepts like social distancing, lots of the different issues around things like stores being closed, and obviously bubbles within school and some of the different rules within schools can be explained using something like a social story. You can see the other social story on this slide is slightly different in that each word isn't represented by a symbol, but there is a symbol to convey the meaning of each sentence. So for example, it says, "When I go to the movies, I wait in line to get my ticket." And then there is a symbol of a queue. So it's just reinforcing the meaning and helping the child to understand that story a little bit clearer. As I mentioned before, some students use symbols as a way of communicating. So that might be students who have limited verbal speech. So for example, at Highfurlong School, we have many children who have physical disabilities like cerebral palsy, and we use these kind of communication books to support their communication. It's also really useful for children who have selective mutism or children who might have very unclear speech due to speech sound disorders. So having something to back up their speech. So you can use symbol-based software to make these kind of communication books or these simple communication boards. Or at the top here, we have a nice little choice board, which again could be used for a student who perhaps gets overwhelmed by too many choices. At break time, they might struggle to know what to do. So giving them 2 simple visual choices could be a way of easing that anxiety. Again, if you're very interested in communication books and boards, please do have a little look at the webinar we did a few weeks ago, and there's lots more information on that topic on that webinar. So I thought I would just give you a few general tips for making visual resources. Some of these are common sense, but it's always worth mentioning. The first one is to make them durable. So laminate them and store frequently used resources in binders. So you can see in the photograph on the slide, the young boy I'm working with has a communication book and it's stored in a really nice binder to keep it safe. There's nothing worse than making lovely resources that have been quite time consuming to make, and then somebody rips them, they become a bit dog-eared, someone spills something on them. So making sure they're durable is really, really important. Make them portable and ensure that they're visible for the student when they need them. So for example, if a student is using a Now and Next board, make sure they can take that board with them to different classes. Make sure it's not on your desk, but it's on their desk or perhaps on the wall near their desk. This is quite an important point, personalize them. So if you're making resources for an individual child to help them to have a little bit of ownership of those resources, it can be nice to incorporate their interests and to discuss with them the resources that you're making. So the child might actually have a little bit of input in making the resource. You could ask them what colors they would like you to use. They could choose some of the pictures, or you could use some of their favorite characters. So, for example, I worked with a young boy with autism a few years ago, and he loved Super Mario. So we made a number of social stories for him. And initially, he wasn't particularly interested in them. But once I put some Super Mario pictures through the story and related some of it to Super Mario, he had ownership over those resources and he felt quite proud of them and he wanted to show them to other people. So just incorporating the child's interest can make a massive difference in how they use those resources. We're going to come on to look at the specific software that you can use in a little minute, but I thought before we do that, I'll just show you some general features that are on most of the software. So most of the software that I'm going to show you has a search feature. And the search feature is so useful because there are so many pre-made resources that you can access. So for example, at Highfurlong, we use Boardmaker, which is used by people all over the world, and many people share their resources. So for example, if I wanted a colourful semantics activity, I might type into the search bar colourful semantics, and then a list of pre-made resources would come up. And then you can edit them if you need to personalize them or tweak them a little bit. So there's a little pencil feature that you can click on and you can slightly tweak things to make them suitable for your class or for an individual student. All of the software that we're going to look at also has templates. So you can see at the bottom here, this is an example of a template. So if I was making a communication book, for example, there will be many different templates that I can choose from. And this makes it so much quicker to make a visual resource. I'm sure you've all tried to make a visual resource in Microsoft Word, for example, and it can be quite time consuming. Things can shift about and move, and you have to keep on going back and editing things. Whereas if you have a pre-made template, you can make quite a nice high quality visual resource quite quickly. So we'll have a look at some of the most commonly used software in schools, and I'm hoping to go through the key features of each just so that you can think, yes, that would really suit the children at my school, or that would suit the children who I work with, and it might help you to match the software to your setting. These are the main software that are used in the UK. So we have Boardmaker Online, which is about to switch to Boardmaker 7. We have Widgit Online. We have Communicate in Print, which is from the same family really as Widgit Online. The only difference is that Communicate in Print is the offline version. So there are a few minor differences, but they are generally quite similar. And then we have Matrix Maker at the bottom. So as you can see, all of the symbols look slightly different. So one word will be conveyed in different ways, and I like to think of symbols as a language, and each symbol set is almost like a different dialect of that language. So they all mean the same thing, but they might look slightly different or be represented in a slightly different way. So we'll talk about each of the software in turn. And the first one I'm going to talk to you about is Boardmaker Online, which is what we use at Highfurlong. So it's the one that I'm most familiar with, although I have used all of the software we're talking about today. Boardmaker Online is about to switch to Boardmaker 7. So if you're interested in it, they are running lots and lots of webinars on Boardmaker 7 at the minute. So if you go on their website, they're running 30-minute webinars that you can jump into and learn a lot more about the new features. So Boardmaker is really commonly used by speech and language therapists, as it's a really good way to make resources that support communication. And the symbol set that it uses is something called PCS. So I'm going to run you through what I feel Boardmaker is best for. As I mentioned before, making communication resources such as books and boards. There are lots and lots of templates for different communication books, which makes it so much easier. They have a really large library of frequently updated symbols. So you can find a symbol for almost anything you can think of. and they're always updating it. So for example, at the moment, they have updated it with symbols related to coronavirus. So there's a symbol to represent social distancing. There's a symbol to represent coronavirus itself. So that's really useful when you're making social stories or visuals around the changes in a school setting. There are loads of pre-made resources. So Boardmaker Online is used by people all over the world, and they frequently upload the resources they've made. The nice thing about Boardmaker Online is I think you can have a free community account. So that means you can access the pre-made resources. You can't edit them and you can't make your own, but you can have a look at the pre-made resources and possibly print them, I think. Boardmaker has a really nice interactive side as well. So you can make activities and then send them to students' iPads. So you can allocate certain activities to certain students. And that's really quite a unique feature of Boardmaker. It also has some additional features, including a core first learning program. So what I mean by that is it's basically a program that supports children to learn the meaning of symbols. So if a child is going to use symbols to communicate, and they might use this kind of communication board that you can see at the top, they need to attach meaning to these symbols so that they can use them in context. So these are what are known as core words, and they're the type of words that we use again and again in our conversation. And we use them in multiple contexts to convey lots of different messages. So this program really supports children who are going to use symbols as their form of communication. Boardmaker also has a reading program called Reading Avenue, and it's a symbol-supported reading program. What I like about it is it has 3 different levels. So all of your class could be working on the same activity, but you could differentiate it depending on their level of need. High contrast symbols for visual impairment. So you can see at the bottom here, we have really colourful symbols on a black background, and these are used for students who have visual impairment. So Boardmaker has a range of symbols that are specific for students with visual impairment, which can be really, really useful. Let's have a look at Widgit. So Widgit Online and Communicate in Print. Widgit is used really commonly in schools across the UK. I think alongside Boardmaker, it's probably the most frequently used software. And they use widget symbols. So whereas Boardmaker uses PCS, Widgit use their own widget symbols. So these are the key points of Widgit that I think make it pretty good. You can make symbol supported books. So it has a feature called automatic symbolization. So you can see in the bottom corner here, a teacher's making a resource for Under the Sea, and they've typed in some sentences, and above each sentence, symbols have automatically popped up to represent each word. So that's a really, really quick and easy way to make a visual resource within 5 minutes. It has the dual language feature that we mentioned earlier. So as far as I'm aware, this is only available on Widgit Online and not in Communicate in Print. So this is the dual language feature that you can see at the top of the screen. This is an example of it. So you can see, first of all, we have the visual, then we have the student's home language, and then we have the English word underneath. So that's ideal if you have students who English is their additional language within your class. It's a really nice way to include them within activities and to promote their home language as well as their new language. Widgit has quite a nice feature in that you can change the skin tone of the symbols that you use. So that's really promoting diversity. I think there's been a lot of conversation around this recently, and I think it's really important that we use visuals that reflect our society, as otherwise it's very difficult for our students to relate to them. So ensuring that we do have different skin tones within our symbols can allow students to see society represented within the visuals that they're using. Widgit Online also has a speech to text feature, which is great for children who maybe struggle with literacy difficulties. And on the flip side of that, it has a text to speech feature. So if you have typed in a sentence, you can then select a button which will read that sentence back to you, which again is great for literacy skills. Widgit Online does have its own literacy program as well called SimWriter 2. It uses the same type of symbols and the same type of features, but it's an additional price, and that is to support students with their literacy specifically. So the last one we're going to look at is Matrix Maker. Matrix Maker is a really quick and easy way to make resources. I have to say, out of the software that I have spoken to you about, Matrix Maker is probably the simplest to use. So if I need to make a resource very quickly, I know I can rustle one up in Matrix Maker in usually about 5 minutes. But that does come at a cost. So there's less customization in Matrix Maker than what you get with Boardmaker and Widgit. So basically that means you use the set templates that are there for you, but you can't make your own or customize the templates that are available. Matrix Maker uses symbol sticks symbols. So you can see an example of them in the bottom picture. And they are really, really colourful, engaging symbols. A lot of children really like them. As you can see from the pictures, they're quite clear. So what's Matrix Maker best for? Ease of use, as I mentioned before. It's a great way to make colourful worksheets and games. I think this is the feature that I like most about Matrix Maker, is that you can make a worksheet very quickly, or they have little game boards that you can slot pictures into and tie in with different topics that you're covering in the classroom. It has a range of templates for visual schedules, communication aids and books. And it has things like certificate templates as well, which is quite nice. As I said before, it has a colourful and engaging symbol set. What some children quite like about Matrix Maker is it's updated with symbols of pop stars, TV shows and characters. So you can find symbols of Taylor Swift, Little Mix, Justin Bieber, most of the pop stars and TV shows that you can think of, which is quite a unique feature to Matrix Maker. So I've covered our 4 main types of software, and I thought, while I've talked about the features of each, the best way to really get to grips with anything is to trial it for yourself. So I thought I would provide you with some links for free trials to each of the software. So if I've talked about one today and you think, I think that would be useful for the students who I work with, it's worthwhile trying the trial before you buy, basically. So Boardmaker has a 1-month free trial, Widgit Online a 21-day free trial, Communicate in Print from the same website you can get a 21 day free trial. Sorry, this has not came out so well at the bottom of the slide. I'll rectify that before we send them out to everybody. Matrix Maker has a 2-week free trial through the Inclusive website. So again, during the summer holidays, it might be nice to have a little look at some of those trials, and you might even be able to make lots of resources to get you ready for September, and then decide from that if you think it would be really useful for your school in future. So that's our webinar finished for today. But on our final slide, you can see at the top here, we have a link to our EdTech website that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar today. So if you want free EdTech advice for your school, you can click this link and sign up. If you want advice specifically around what we've talked about today, myself and Erica, who introduced the webinar, would be more than happy to help you with that. You can also follow us on Twitter. So Erica at Erica Smith 2019. You can follow me, Sarah Alderman at SazAlder. Neil Oldham, who is our head teacher, at Neil Oldham, and then you can follow our school at Highfurlong. So we do all tend to tweet about technology quite a lot, particularly assistive technology and communication aids. So following our webinar today, are there any questions?
Hi Sarah, I can't see any questions in the chat box.
Okay.
So thank you so much for all that information. I think it's fantastic. And we will be having another webinar on Thursday, the 9th of July at 4 o'clock, which is preparing for September. And that is all 3 schools as part of our consortium will be doing a webinar then. So please sign up as given the link that Sarah has just shown on the previous slide. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. And we will be sending out the slides for today's presentation if anybody wants a copy. Thank you for attending today.
We'll send the link and the slides. All the webinars we've run are on our Consortium website, so you will receive that link with the feedback questionnaires. Thanks, everyone.